Okay, hey guys, welcome to our first double of term two. I hope you had a really good break. I hope you were safe, and I hope you're looking forward to getting started. We've got a long term ahead of us and a few things to go through. We do have an assessment coming up, and you'll get more details about that soon, but the subject of this video is the topic of pandemics, something we're going to be looking at over probably this double and the next double, possibly even the one after, but I think we'll limit it to two doubles. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about pandemics, so as to set the scene, and then afterward, you guys have a bit of work to do. You'll have the week's homework worth of work, and then next week, I would want you to be ready to talk about the issues in an informed way. So what I might do is I might arrange some Google Meet meetings with some of you, and we'll talk about that in next week's briefing. But look ahead to next week being a week in which you discuss the issues brought up in this topic. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. Pandemic, essentially defined, is a disease that's prevalent over a whole country or world. And that's something we're going through right now, as you guys can no doubt tell. COVID-19 is a pandemic that kicked off properly in China in about December, and then by February had started spreading to the rest of the world, and today I think there are something over 2 million cases and over 120,000 odd deaths. So pretty crazy, really. And Australia hasn't been spared, of course. You know, you've got 6,500 cases and a significant number of deaths. Perhaps less than some other places, but significant nonetheless. So it's important for us in politics to kind of deal with this issue. You know, how do politicians, how do societies cope with pandemics? What are the decision-making sequences you have to go through? What are some of the factors involved? How do you slow something like this down? How do you even think about it? And what are the actions you actually take to stop it, to prevent catastrophe? So that's the subject of today's lesson. We're going to look at it in a couple of different ways. One, we're going to look at some historic equivalents, and then we'll sort of talk about what that means for you guys going forward and what we're going to be doing today and next week. Okay, so pandemics have kind of been with us for as long as we've had recorded history, and some of the biggest ones we've got pretty good detail of. You know, we've got a graphic here on the right that gives you a sense of scale, that gives you a sense of how big things are in relation to one another. And going through them, you know, you've got the two plagues that hit the Roman Empire, the Antonine and the Justinian plagues. We suspect that they're probably smallpox related, both of them. And each of those plagues devastated the Roman Empire. You know, a lot of historians, for example, blame the Antonine plague for weakening the Roman Empire to the point where it was eventually destroyed from a number of different influences. Then you had the big one, the big granddaddy of them all, the one we spent a lot of time talking about, and that was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. That killed about 30 to 40% of all Europeans, but it hit the whole world. It hit all of Eurasia, essentially. I shouldn't say the whole world, all of Eurasia. So China, India, Europe, everything in between was stricken by this plague. And in Europe alone, it killed something like 200 million people. In Europe alone, it killed something like 40 or 50 million. Around the world, about 200 million people. So enormous. Hard to overstate just how big, just how damaging. There were cities in Italy, for example, that lost between 60 and 80% of their population in those 6 odd years. So pretty crazy stuff, and really hard to compare to something like COVID. Smallpox has been with us for a long time. Multiple smallpox plagues have broken out. So the 17th century and 18th century Great Plagues, those were very likely smallpox, and those took a lot of people. And then you had the Spanish flu, which was in some ways similar to COVID-19. It spread right after World War I, all around the planet, and it killed probably about 40 or 50 million people. Fortunately for us, it was very different to the way COVID attacks the population. So the Spanish flu mainly killed young people, pregnant women, and children. You know, older people were not as affected, whereas COVID it's kind of the reverse. And without being callous and silly about it, I think there's a clear preference there, you know, for who should be, if you have to put someone up in front of a plague, who should be in that situation. It's probably someone who's closer to the end of their life than the beginning of it. HIV has been with us for a little while. It's killed a lot of people, but it's taken a long time to do it, so a lot of the time we don't really feel it, and it's also not as easy to transmit as some of these other diseases. And finally, Corona, which at the time of the printing of this graphic had only killed about 6,500 people, but we're up to 120,000, so it's right up there. It's one of the most damaging diseases. You'll note that it still killed fewer than the swine flu from 2009 to 2010, and that's one we don't talk a lot about. Flu, just this common strains, kills something like 500,000 people a year. So put it all in context. Governments have to do a lot of stuff to deal with plague, and that's sort of our topic today. That's the thing we've got to really take into consideration today and talk about in political terms. So what are those challenges? Well, you've got firstly the obvious that deaths and the incapacitated population, meaning people who are bedridden or otherwise unable to move and work, they present social and economic problems. From unemployment to having to give out enormous amounts of welfare and look after the infirm, the sick. These things require political responses. You know, you've got from medical treatment to quarantine to new laws, changes to personal habits, changes to public habits, and economic initiatives. All of those need to happen. All of those need to be part of any solution. And over time and over the historical periods we've been talking about, you see examples of all of the above. So success in dealing with any pandemic depends on a lot of factors, but you got things like timing, efficacy, meaning how well it's dealt with, and willpower, you know, what you're willing to do in terms of difficult measures, unpopular measures to control disease. So for example, the Chinese government in dealing with COVID instituted some really full-on and draconian laws, meaning harsh laws. Things like walling people off in their apartments if they're sick to prevent the spread of the disease. Those are the sort of things the government can only do in some situations, and it can lose a lot of popularity doing it. So it's a real interesting political question. The historical case I want to look at is the Black Death, because we've got really sort of detailed historical artifacts, meaning detailed historical accounts of how different governments dealt with the Black Death. So after it kind of found its initial foothold in Italy in 1347 in the city of Genoa, it spread to most of Europe within a year. Similar to COVID, you know, very, very quick spread. It wasn't well understood, and the responses to it ranged from just kind of dealing with the consequences or the damage, basically carting away bodies and looking after sick people, to different levels of political action. And we're going to look at three examples. We're going to look at that of Venice, of Milan, and of Poland. So the first example in terms of the Black Death that we're going to deal with is Venice. It was one of the first cities to actually bring in what we call today isolation measures. So what it basically did was ships that would come into the port of Venice, which is how it did its trade, were subjected to about 30 days of isolation. And this was eventually increased to 40 days. And you see here that it actually gave rise to the term quarantine, which means 40 days in Italian, quarantina. Then they established these remote cemeteries with really strict rules about how you collect bodies, how you get them there, and how you bury them, which made a difference in terms of how fast the disease spread. And then you had doctors kind of being given special long-beak masks, which look really silly, and you can look them up. They're called the bauta, or the botta, and they were meant to limit the exposure. But you still have a death rate of about 25 to 30%. So it's not like these measures stopped the disease, you know, in its tracks. It still killed a lot of people, but you compare it to an Italian average of almost 60% in cities. It's enormous. So they did find some success in dealing with the disease. Then you've got the example of Milan, also in Italy, an inland city, so it doesn't have a port. And the plague didn't reach it as quickly. There was more awareness of what was happening, so the Milanese knew what was coming. They brought strict isolation measures in. So kind of like the Chinese government did this year, they actually walled off families that had been stricken with the plague inside their own houses where they would most often die. They were really callous about it. You know, they didn't let morality get in the way of trying to control the disease. And they had actually quite a lot of success. I mean, all of that coupled with setting up hospitals outside the city, limiting exposure, meant that their death rate was actually something like 15%, even lower than Venice. One of the least affected cities in Europe. So its measures were successful, largely. And then you get Poland, kind of distant from where the plague had taken hold and where it had really spread quickly. Kind of Eastern Europe, Northeastern Europe, large place, lots of distance between the population centers. Much more aware of the plague by the time it hit. They knew it was coming. And you get King Casimir the Great closing borders, which means, stopping traffic at the borders. And traffic in this time isn't made up of cars. It's made up of mules with carts, horses, things like that, and foot traffic. Stopping that at the borders, imposing a really strict quarantine. And because of the distance between the cities, a lot of people who got sick on the way would actually die before getting to the next place. Like, for example, if you wanted to go from Prague in Czechia, which is a neighboring country, and you wanted to get to Krakow in Poland, it would take you about a week on horseback. Most people who got the disease would die within 3 days. So on the way, they'd die before they get a chance to infect people in the next population center. And Poland, as a result, had a death rate of about 20 to 25%, whereas the European average was much, much higher. So they found some success too. So you got these three examples, three different ways of dealing with the disease. Each had success in its own right. And it's important for you guys to think about which was the most successful, not in historical terms, but in terms of political action. What did these people do politically to try to control the disease? What you guys are going to be doing today is you're going to be setting up a new Google Doc in your Yunnan Politics folder. I want you to call it Pandemics, and you're going to answer all the questions you see in the slide below. You're going to need to do some background reading. So there's a slide just below this one with some background reading set out. I'd like you to complete everything in full sentences and provide some detail. Don't do the bare minimum. Provide detail. Show me that you read. Show me that you know. It's all due next week. And I'll be checking over your Google folders to make sure it's there and make sure it's done before we have that discussion on the class forum. And Pandemics will be the basis of the next week's topic, like I said earlier. But whether it's the first assessment task, we'll see. I'm still thinking about that one, to be honest. It might be something slightly different because our assessment task probably isn't going to happen for a few weeks yet. I thought it might have to be next week or the week after that we start, but it might actually be a few weeks away. Okay, so this is the page of resources. Go through each. They're not too long, but there's a fair bit of info, not only on the Black Death, but also on Corona, and you're going to use the historical research as a sort of basis for thinking about what we can be doing today. And you're going to go through all of these questions, making sure that you answer them as well as you possibly can. You've got some historical questions, and then of course you've got the more contemporary ones, the ones for today, the ones that we're talking about Corona as a pandemic. I would like it to be as detailed as possible. There's only, 10 or so questions, so it's not a huge thing. But the better the effort is and the more you put in, the more impressive your work will be and the more it will develop your understanding. If you aren't sure about anything, definitely let me know in the thread or by emailing me, and I might make myself available for Google Meet, but there'll be more details on that. Okay, I hope you have a good double. I'll be online, so feel free to ask anything you want, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you can do. Have a great one, enjoy the week, and I'll see you again next week.